I'm going to say something and you might not agree with me, but in my experience, this is the truth. Marketing a podcast is harder than having a podcast. Now, finding the right people that should be listening to your podcast and reminding them every week to listen to your podcast is actually harder than making the podcast itself, and that part isn't easy. In this episode, we're going to talk about why your podcast marketing isn't working, what you can do to improve, and how we can make small changes to start rebuilding our listener base and engaging our existing audience. Hello and welcome to Podcast for Profit. My name is Morgan Franklin. I'm a podcast producer, strategist, and educator. This podcast will help you create and grow a podcast that cuts through the noise of social media and speaks directly to your target audience. If you're ready to create a podcast that will align you with the experts in your industry, position yourself as a trusted leader, and create another source of revenue for your business, you're in the right place. I did a poll with 100 podcasters a few months ago on Threads, and I asked, how would you spend $1,000 on your podcast? About 80% of the people said advertising. But then when I asked how they would use that money on advertising, there wasn't really a very clear answer. And the truth is that most podcast marketing doesn't work that well because it's just not at the right time and place. I've talked about this several episodes in the past, but if, for example, you are relying on short form clips on, let's say, TikTok or Instagram Reels to be converting into listeners, as my granny would say, you got a long road to hoe. Because think about this. You're scrolling on TikTok, maybe at the end of a long day, you're exhausted. Like so many of us are. We're turning off our brain. We're just flipping through these videos. Even if you come across a podcast that you think is so funny or smart or whatever you may want in a podcast, the likelihood of you doing anything more than just bookmarking it or saving it for later is very slim. And honestly, how often do you go back and look at those saved videos or bookmarks on social media? Is this to say that I think marketing your podcast on short form video is pointless? No, not at all. I think you should be using it. I think that TikTok specifically is the best place for awareness and growth potential. The average user spends about 95 minutes a day on TikTok. And in the United States, we have 160 million active users. Now, I'll let you do the math on that one. But what I'm trying to say is it might not be the best place to market your podcast if you want conversion from podcast downloads and listens, but it is so amazing for awareness. So make sure that you're utilizing it, especially in the United States. We know that we only have until about April that for sure TikTok is going to be here. So if you know you want to use it, make sure that you are utilizing that time on the platform. A short form video strategy that I've not heard anyone talk about is using YouTube Shorts, which is kind of the TikTok short form version of YouTube videos. So basically what you would do is make one of these short form videos and then link your longer episode that's also on YouTube so that someone will hopefully subscribe to your channel. And if you're looking for them to convert to the full episode, I think that utilizing YouTube and YouTube Shorts is like the perfect conjunction and a great place to do this. Because you don't have to go off of another app and people can subscribe to you there. You know, there really should be a place for brand awareness in your marketing strategy of your podcast because like people seeing your podcast on TikTok or Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts and watching that 30-second clip, there is a place for that instead of having that direct conversion like you might have on Facebook or LinkedIn or even Pinterest. You need to recognize the difference. And that's when you can start properly marketing your podcast episodes. We have to understand the difference between awareness and a direct conversion to a potential subscriber. So when I say that there needs to be a right place and a right time, I mean that your listener needs to be in the zone for listening to a podcast, or at the least in the zone to be opening their podcast platform app to follow your podcast. In my opinion, one of the best ways to market your podcast is to be a guest on another podcast. And I know that this isn't a task that you can just pay an agency to do, and it's not traditional podcast marketing, but it's fixing the exact problem we were talking about earlier about meeting people at the right place and time. If your imaginary listener is already listening to this podcast episode that you're a guest on, then they're already listening to a podcast. They're already on a podcast platform app of their choosing. They're getting to know you. They can follow your podcast while they're still listening to this other one. And if they like you, chances are they are going to want to follow your podcast and listen to it. Another thing that guesting does is it provides that social proof to your future listener. So they know that they like the podcast that you're guesting on. So most likely they trust the host and they want more of what they're currently getting. This is why you need to be strategic with the podcast that you guest on. That is very important too. Make sure that the person has an audience that you'd want to share and that it makes sense for your time and effort. I think so often podcasters are like, I'm going to go on every single podcast that could even possibly make sense. And I think that that's kind of a waste of time. But what I do think that you should do is investigate who their audience is. What is the kind of production that they are putting out? And do you want to be associated with that? Listen to a few of their episodes and make sure that this is worth your time and effort. Make sure, are people listening to this? Go look up their listen notes. Go see if they're ranking on anything. Is this worth your time and effort? Do they even have an audience that you would want to speak to? So that's a free way to market your podcast usually. So let's talk about paid ways to market your podcast. Paid ads. Now, it might not be paid ads in the sense that you might be thinking, like Meta or Google ads. I think that those can both be effective, but again, are you at the right place and the right time for that potential podcast listener? If I were investing $1,000 into paid ads for my podcast, I'd be on another podcast's ads or on another podcast platform. So for example, Spotify, you can buy banner ads, you can buy audio ads, you can buy all kinds of ads. And that is where your listener is. You are meeting them at the time and place when they are looking for something to listen to. And you can niche this down so far. So even if, let's say that you have a business investing podcast, you can drill it down to people who are looking for business investment podcasts. This is so easy and so specific to make sure you are getting the person that you're looking for. And I know that you can do the same thing on Pocket Cast and a few of the other podcasting platforms. So do a little bit of research and find out who you can advertise with that is a podcast platform where you can advertise your podcast to people who are looking for a podcast to listen to. There is no better right place, right time than that, right? Another way that you could utilize paid ads is advertising in a relevant space online that is specific to your niche. So for example, if it were me, if I wanted to sponsor a blog post or a video of another podcast creator to talk about my podcast, that would be meeting my audience where they are and what kind of information they're looking for, right? Like, let's say that this is someone that makes all their content about podcast microphones. If I were to buy a paid ad with that person, that would be my market. That would be the people who are looking for me. So think about the niche opportunities that you have and the ways that you could spend your money to be closer to those other kinds of creators that could align themselves, their brand, with who you are looking to speak to. But make sure that you are keeping in mind, would this actually convert to someone listening? Because we can go way off into left field. Or, for example, you could sponsor a YouTube video that then links back to the episode that you want people to listen to. So make sure that you're being very specific with that and that you have a clear path to someone actually listening to your podcast or to a specific podcast episode. Most podcast advertising doesn't work because it's selfish. And I know that I've said this before, but posting about a new episode for the sake of sharing that you have a new episode is not enough. That should be the status quo. If you have a podcast, you should be putting out a new episode every week or whatever amount of time that you normally put out a new episode. This is not news. So instead, take the time to tell me why I'd be interested in this episode. Short clips from podcasts work for a long time. And I think to some extent that they still do. So just taking a little clip out of your episode. But what's so much better is you making a piece of content that explains to your audience, to me, why you made that episode. Take the time. Don't be selfish. Don't be lazy. Explain to your audience why you made this episode, why you think that they'd like it, and where they can listen to it. time is our most precious resource. And if we think that someone is going to listen to our podcast just because it's a new episode, we are incorrect. If I could task you and every podcaster with one thing that would help convert social media content into an actual listener, it would be to explain where your listener can listen to the podcast. And I know that this sounds useless, but hear me out. There are so many people that you're trying to get to listen to your podcast episode that hardly know what a podcast is. And I know this sounds impossible, but it's not. We think podcasting is so mainstream and well known. And while we're getting there for sure, you can have a beautiful post that is so engaging and that the person thinks, wow, I really want to listen to this podcast or this episode, but they have no idea how to do it. All right, so the first thing is most of us are not being straightforward enough and reminding people clearly and consistently what the name of our podcast is. And I could go on an entire episode long rant about this. I won't. But half the time someone's like, listen to my podcast episode or showing a clip from their podcast. I have no idea what podcast that's from. I'm hunting around the profile. I'm totally lost. I'm starting to think that maybe they don't even have a podcast. This was just a podcast they were a guest on. And I'm so guilty of this too. I remember a few years ago, before I really kind of realized this, I would be making promotional content for podcasts that I was producing. And I just put the cover art for the podcast, so the logo so tiny on the video, and think that people knew what that meant. They don't. They don't know what it means. They don't. So what I want you to say is I want you to spell it out for people. Say, you can listen to my podcast, Podcast for Profit with Morgan Franklin, new episodes on Monday on all major streaming platforms and YouTube. So tell people what day it comes out. Tell the full name of your podcast. Tell them where it is. Tell them if it's on YouTube. Don't leave anything to chance, because I promise you, people don't even know the name of your podcast. And another thing in this vein is having the correct linking to your podcast. It is 2025. There is no reason your audience has to look around for where to listen to your podcast. It better be linked everywhere. It's in your link tree. It's in your posts. It's connected to everything with the full name of the podcast. And if you think it's overkill, then you're probably doing it right. Because I'm telling you, I record anywhere from 4 to 8 podcast episodes a month with guests. And these people don't know where to find podcasts, and they don't really understand how podcasts work. So they are people that are literally coming on podcasts that don't know how they work. They have no idea how to listen to them. So make sure that you are telling people, hey, go listen to this episode in the link in the caption, wherever it may be. Tell people where to go. So the last thing that I want to talk about in this episode is being consistent with advertising new episodes. And whether this is free or paid advertising, there is no reason a week goes by and you aren't telling people about your new episode. They say it takes 8 to 12 touch points for a buyer to buy. And we've already talked about this earlier in the episode, but listeners are giving you their most precious resource of all, their time. So if you really want people to listen to your podcast episodes, you should probably be putting out at least one piece of content every day, but never, ever less than once a week. Because truthfully, at that point, why even have one? And if you want to work with me one-on-one to create podcast advertising that works for your podcast, my coaching information is in the episode description, or you can email me at morgan@morganfranklin.media. You can also shop my digital template store that will definitely help you get started with making social media posts. I have Canva templates for social media that I've designed and perfected over the years to help convert followers into listeners. And as always, I can't wait to listen to your podcast. Hey, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and you'd like to hear more episodes like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the show. New episodes air every Monday morning. And if you found this episode valuable and you want to help other business owners and podcasters, will you leave me a 5-star review? It helps the show rank higher in the charts and brings more entrepreneurs the information they need to start making money on their podcast.